Domestic violence, unfortunately, was not uncommon at all times, and often victims, for various reasons, prefer to silently tolerate this attitude to themselves. And the domestic tyrant, feeling his impunity, can overstep any boundaries. The worst thing in such situations is that children can become victims. A few years ago, the case of young Tylee Palmer shook the whole of Australia with its extraordinary cruelty and monstrous coincidence of circumstances, when a child from one dysfunctional family fell into another family, even more terrible and cruel. The girl's birth mother, trying to protect her only daughter from her tyrant husband, gave her to another family out of the best intentions. But as it turned out, she put Tylee in the hands of death itself. The case under consideration is quite complex and ambiguous. There were several criminals, and all of them were members of the same family. At the same time, the investigation came to the conclusion that almost all of them were victims of domestic tyranny themselves. And now I will tell about everything in order. A girl from a dysfunctional family. Tylee Alicia Rose Palmer was born in a small Australian town, Logan City, Queensland, in April 2003. Unfortunately, the conditions in which the girl grew up were far from ideal. The head of the family abused hot drinks, was a man hot-tempered and aggressive. He repeatedly beat his wife in front of the child and at times got to the daughter herself. The girl was constantly under stress, lived in an atmosphere of fear and oppression. It is not surprising that over time she began to regularly run away from home, so as not to hear the endless scandals of parents and not get under the hot hand of the father. About why the girl's mother, Cynthia Palmer, did not leave the man who abused her and her daughter, we can only guess. However, instead, the young woman chose to give her only child to another family, believing that this would be better. Subsequently, Cynthia repeatedly stated that it was a forced measure and that she was very sorry about it, but at that time to do otherwise could not, because she herself was hostage to circumstances. But there is another version, told by neighbors of the dysfunctional family. According to some reports, Cynthia herself is addicted to alcohol. She tried treatment, but to overcome addiction was not so easy. And after another escape Tylee from home, when she was found wandering the streets on the other side of the city, the Palmer family seriously interested in child protection services. Representatives of the service visited the family home and offered help, and Cynthia did not refuse to have her daughter temporarily placed in a foster home. Given the environment in which the girl was brought up, it is not surprising that she grew up to be a difficult teenager with a difficult character. Therefore, finding her a foster family was not an easy task. She was constantly running away, loitering and begging on the streets, disobeying her guardians, doing everything in her own way. Tylee did not stay with her first two families for long, because her foster parents simply could not cope with her. She did not commit any serious offenses, but she was periodically accused of lying. The girl wanted the comfort of home, but did not imagine what it should be, and any disagreement with the household inevitably ended with the escape of the child, the Thorburn family. In early 2015, it seemed that the perfect foster family had been found for Tylee and was ready to welcome her with open arms. The Thorburn family consisted of 4 people. Spouses Rick and Julia Thorburn were raising 2 sons, Josh, who was already 19 years old at the time, and Trent, who was barely 18. The family lived in a spacious 2-story house with a swimming pool, located in a small country place in the suburbs of Brisbane. They owned their own horse farm, and Julia organized a private kindergarten at home, which was very popular, and local parents willingly trusted the Thorburns with their children. The family was considered well-to-do and prosperous, well-regarded in their home state, and trustworthy. In addition, they had indicated a willingness to take a troubled teenager into their care, which was rare. Child Protective Services decided that this option was the most suitable for Tylee, and in January, the girl moved into a new home. At first, everything went according to the usual scenario. The girl rebelled, refused to live with her guardians, and ran away from them several times, but each time the Child Welfare Service found her and sent her back. But as the months went by, Tylee seemed to calm down, accepted her new family, and got along with them. In reality, however, the outward well-being hid a real drama that soon spiraled into tragedy: the mysterious disappearance of Tylee. The girl studied in one of the local schools, which was located a few kilometers from the house of her guardians, so the foster father took Tylee to school every day and after school picked her up. She made a lot of friends in the new place, who spoke of her as a kind, cheerful girl. But she still dreamed of returning to her home and kept in touch with her biological mother and grandmother. Tylee also occasionally complained of discomfort and even fear. without specifying what exactly she was afraid of. On the morning of October 30th, 2015, Rick drove his car to school as usual, and then returned home to do chores. But soon he received a phone call informing him that his adopted daughter had failed to show up for class. No one was particularly worried, because the girl had run away many times before, but usually she returned in the evening or the next day. The guardians reported the incident to the police, and almost immediately the search for missing Tylee began. All members of the family willingly cooperated with the investigation and claimed that no conflicts that could provoke a runaway between them and Tylee for a long time has not been. On the contrary, the girl was in good spirits and looked quite happy. According to the head of the family, he took his daughter to school, as he usually did, and then drove back home and tended to the horses until he received a call from a teacher and reported the disappearance of the girl. His spouse and sons confirmed these words. The next day, the Thorburns created a social media page dedicated to the search for Tylee. There they posted information about her photos, the time and circumstances of her disappearance, as well as a description of the clothes she was wearing that day. The couple asked anyone who knew anything about Tylee's whereabouts to report it to them or to the police, but no one ever called. Police also searched the family's home and estate, but found nothing suspicious there. Although the behavior of the foster parents seemed too calm, they had essentially nothing to charge them. Soon, the search operation was joined by many concerned people, sincerely concerned about the fate of the girl. They combed the area, pasted flyers with her photos, and interviewed local residents, hoping to get at least some useful information. A discovery on the riverbank. After a week of unsuccessful searches, 2 fishermen turned to the police, reporting a terrible find. According to the men, on the morning of November 5th, they went to the Pimpama River, but after barely casting their fishing rods, they noticed something strange in the swampy, shallow water. As they got closer, the fishermen were horrified, as they realized that their find was nothing but human remains. The police officers who arrived on the call noted that it was the body of a short man, but it was so disfigured that it was impossible even to identify the sex of the deceased. There were no clothes on him, and no personal belongings could be found nearby. The body had numerous injuries that were initially thought to have been left by wild animals in the area. In addition, it was badly decomposed due to heat, moisture, and numerous insects, which were attracted by the characteristic odor. The gruesome find was sent for examination, where it was determined that it was a girl, whose approximate age was between 12 and 16 years old. Then the police collected information about all missing young people recently, and soon the corpse was identified. It was Tylee Palmer, which for almost a week the whole city was looking for. The cause of death was impossible to determine, because the body had been in the water for a long time. But experts speculated that Tylee died of asphyxiation after discovering that her hyoid bone had been crushed. The most horrifying thing, however, was that the injuries, which were initially suspected to be animal bites, could have been inflicted by a person even before Tylee's death. It was immediately clear that Tylee's death was criminal in nature, so a criminal case was opened and a murder investigation was launched. But the investigation was moving very slowly, because no serious leads could not be found yet, which meant that the process could take months or even years, or turn into another unsolved crime. The case quickly gained publicity, so to say goodbye to the dead girl came almost a quarter of the city's population. People carried flowers, soft toys, and balloons to the place where the memorial service was held. On November 14th, the body of young Tylee was cremated. Tylee's birth mother gave a series of interviews to reporters in which she openly accused Child Protective Services of criminal negligence that led to the tragedy. The strange Thorburns, the foster family, willingly cooperated with the investigation from the beginning, but their behavior raised certain suspicions. The last person to see the girl alive was supposedly Rick, but no one could confirm that he actually brought his foster daughter to school on the morning of October 30th. His spouse and sons claimed to have seen Tylee get into the car. Surveillance cameras along the route to the school also showed the car traveling in that direction, but no footage of Tylee leaving her guardian's car could be found anywhere. None of the teachers or classmates saw the girl that day, either at school or on school grounds. Tylee seemed to have vanished, although investigators had growing doubts that Palmer was even in the car. Family members occasionally confused their testimony about the events of that day, but insisted that everything was as it always was and there was nothing to portend trouble. Unchildren's secrets. As part of the investigation, dozens of children and teenagers were interviewed, with whom the deceased went to the same school and was friends. All spoke positively about her, but noted that recently Tylee had been worried about something. but she could not or was afraid to talk about it. A few days before the tragedy, Tylee asked a classmate to shelter her for a while. She said she was in trouble and the guardians would kill her. These words were not taken seriously, and the friend, though she felt sorry for her, could not bring someone to her house for a sleepover without parental consent. The other girl mentioned that Palmer had told her secret. She was in love with the youngest of the Thorburn brothers, 18-year-old Trent. Moreover, she even bragged that they were romantically involved and would be together in the future. The latter revelation sounded rather strange because Tylee was only 12 years old, and a relationship with an older brother, even an adopted one, seemed something unlikely, like a childish fantasy. Nevertheless, the information she received was definitely something she had to check out. The members of the Thorburn family categorically denied any suspicions. They called their dead adopted daughter a liar who wanted to draw attention to herself, and also suggested that the girl's school friends could have made up something themselves or fantasized. There was no solid evidence to suspect the guardians of committing a crime against Tylee, so they remained at large, continuing to do their usual business. Their private kindergarten continued to take children. The farm prospered, and they didn't have to deal with the pain of loss. For several months, the investigation was actually treading on the same ground. Local residents with previous convictions were questioned, and those previously suspected of crimes were checked. But the search yielded no results, and no new leads appeared. Even the announced high reward for any information about the case did not move the process forward. A parallel search was conducted in the area where Tylee's body was found, and a month later, under a layer of silt, were found a backpack and a shoe, which presumably could belong to the deceased. They were found 150 meters away from where the body was. These things were obviously wanted to get rid of so that they would never be found. The whole story gained a wide public resonance. The results of the search and investigation were broadcast on television, published in the press, and the residents of the city organized pickets demanding to find and punish the killer or killers. Some pickets were organized by the biological mother of the deceased Tylee. Eventually, it came to the point where the police appealed to possible accomplices of the perpetrator, promising them protection and immunity if they named the perpetrator or provided any substantial information. But this appeal also went unanswered. In 6 months, no new clues or avenues of inquiry have emerged. An anonymous call and a wiretap at the Thorburn house. It wasn't until closer to the summer of 2016 that police received an anonymous call that changed the course of the investigation. The anonymous caller said that the Thorburns were looking for a troubled teenager for a reason. They were driven by a mercantile interest, because the custody of troubled children are paid an increased allowance. Anonymous also added that their youngest son, most likely, had an intimate relationship with Tylee, which he himself mentioned in passing before the tragedy. Of course, this information could have been a lie, but detectives remembered that they had already heard the theory that Tylee and her named brother might have had an affair, from a high school friend of the deceased. The investigators decided not just to take a closer look at Trent, but to take a hard look at him. The interrogations yielded nothing, because the guy and his family members continued to insist on their non-involvement, claiming that the girl herself ran away and then got into trouble. The family's social media pages were quietly checked, and one of the chat rooms in Trent's profile revealed a curious correspondence. About a month and a half before the tragedy, he wrote to his cousin that he had intimacy with a girl much younger than him, but her name he did not give. Of course, the dialogue on the social network could not become incontrovertible evidence, but it allowed the police to obtain permission to install listening devices in the Thorburn house, of course, without their knowledge. Already in the first few days, the wiretaps yielded shocking results. On the recordings, the family members could be heard working out their version of events in detail, so that their stories coincided in the smallest detail. The head of the family taught his household what to say and how to behave, and from the mouth of the mother sounded such phrases as, "Dad made this decision to save us. We'll have to live with it. Never tell anyone or anything, no matter what happens." Several times Rick threatened his family members, and it was obvious that they were afraid of him because they knew that his father could go from words to action at any moment. There was still not enough direct evidence, but the Thorburns' blue card, which gave them permission to work with children, was almost immediately canceled, so the private kindergarten had to be closed. The wiretap soon provided confirmation that the youngest of the brothers had indeed been intimate with Tylee. In fact, it happened regularly for several months, and in October he told his mother that Tylee was showing signs of pregnancy. If this hunch had been confirmed, Trent would have gone straight to jail for having an affair with young Tylee. That's when Julia told her husband everything, and Rick decided to take matters into his own hands. On the day of the tragedy, Julia and her sons went to Brisbane early in the morning, ostensibly on business. It was supposed to serve as an alibi for them, and Rick stayed home with his adopted daughter. When the mother and heirs returned home in the evening, it was already known that the girl was missing, and the head of the family said that he had solved the problem without specifying details. Arrest and investigation. Based on the records obtained, all members of the family decided to re-interview, and the police also decided to search Rick's car, in which he allegedly drove his adopted daughter to school on the day of her disappearance. And then it turned out that the car was sold almost immediately after the tragedy. The vehicle was tracked down, and a detailed inspection of it revealed old washed-out traces of blood in the trunk. DNA analysis revealed that the blood belonged to the murdered Tylee. After that, the last doubts were dispelled, and the Thorburns were taken into custody. They were questioned separately, and Trent was the first to speak. It turned out that he had tricked Tylee into seducing him, telling her about his feelings, promising that they would always be together, and Tylee, in love with him, believed it, and even bragged to her friends at school that she was in a real relationship. But when she got suspicious about the pregnancy, she realized that the foster father could kill her, literally, and began to ask her classmates to take her in, at least for a while. Rick fought back the longest, but under pressure from evidence and testimony from his family members, he confessed to killing his foster daughter, saying he was just trying to protect his family. He had indeed strangled Tylee and afterward disfigured her body, hoping no one would ever identify him. The possibility of DNA testing, Rick somehow didn't think about. When the head of the family was formally charged with first-degree murder, he collapsed and was rushed to the hospital with a heart attack. There, doctors concluded that he had provoked the attack himself by taking a large dose of powerful drugs. They fought for his life for several days so that the perpetrator could stand trial and receive a fair punishment. The trial and sentencing of each of the family members. The investigation and trial was followed by the whole country, because the Tylee Palmer case became one of the loudest and cruelest in the last 10 years. Each member of the Thorburn family was found guilty, but their sentences were considered by many to be too lenient. For example, the eldest son, Josh, was sentenced to only 3 months in prison for perjury and attempting to obfuscate the investigation. The court took into account his sincere remorse and the fact that he was a key witness against his father and younger brother at the trial. Julia Thorburn received 1.5 years in prison for perjury and harboring her husband and son. At trial, she admitted that she was very afraid of her spouse and believed that he could also massacre her and her sons. The youngest of the brothers was sentenced to 4 years in prison, which many considered too lenient a punishment for seducing Tylee, perjury, and obstructing the investigation. In fact, the young man served only a little more than 1 year, after which he was released early. The head of the family, who dealt with Tylee in the most brutal way, was sentenced to life imprisonment. He himself pleaded guilty to all counts, noting that he was very sorry for what he had done. Rick kept repeating that he was driven by the desire to protect his family, but he himself does not understand how he could go to such a crime. After the final verdict, Tylee's birth mother gave an interview in which she said that none of the punishments for her daughter's killers she would have considered harsh enough, but the day of the verdict marked the end of her fight for justice.